The screams had stopped an hour ago, but Beatrice Jensen could still hear them echoing in her mind as she stumbled through the blizzard, one hand pressed against the knife wound in her side, the other reaching blindly into the white void ahead. Her husband had done this. Marcus had actually stabbed her and left her to die in the worst storm Colorado had seen in a decade, all because she had discovered his plans to rob the bank where her father kept his life savings. The snow fell so thick she could barely see her own boots, and the wind howled like some ancient demon determined to drag her soul straight to hell. Blood seeped between her fingers, warm against her freezing skin, and she knew with terrible certainty that she would not make it much farther. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed into a snowdrift, the white crystals immediately beginning to cover her dark hair and the crimson stain spreading across her coat. The cold felt almost peaceful now, which frightened her more than the pain. She had heard stories of people freezing to death, how they simply fell asleep and never woke up, and part of her wanted to surrender to that gentle darkness. But another part, the stubborn part that had helped her survive 22 years in this harsh territory, refused to give up so easily. She tried to push herself up, but her arms had no strength left. The world tilted sideways, and she found herself staring at the gray sky as snowflakes landed on her eyelashes and melted against her flushed cheeks. This was not how she had imagined her life would end. When she had married Marcus 3 years ago in Cripple Creek, she had believed in love and partnership and building a future together in the mining town that had boomed with gold fever. She had been so naive, so trusting, so completely blind to the darkness lurking behind his charming smile. Her vision began to blur, the edges going soft and hazy, and she wondered if this was what dying felt like. Then she heard something that cut through the wind, a sound that seemed impossible in this frozen wasteland. Hoofbeats. Someone was riding through the storm and they were getting closer. She tried to call out, but her voice came out as barely a whisper, stolen away by the blizzard before it could travel more than a few inches. The hoofbeats grew louder, and then a shape materialized through the white curtain, a horse and rider moving with surprising confidence despite the terrible conditions. The horse, a sturdy bay with a thick winter coat, stopped just a few feet from where she lay, and the rider dismounted quickly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a heavy sheepskin coat and a wide-brimmed hat that was already covered in snow. His face was partially obscured by a bandana he had pulled up over his nose and mouth to protect against the wind, but she could see his eyes, a striking blue-gray that widened with alarm when he saw her lying there in the snow. He dropped to his knees beside her, his gloved hands already reaching for her, checking for injuries with a practiced efficiency that spoke of experience with emergencies. "Easy now, I have got you," he said, his voice deep and steady despite the urgency of the situation. He pulled the bandana down, revealing a strong jaw darkened with several days of stubble and a mouth set in a grim line. "What happened? Who did this to you?" she tried to answer, but the words would not come. Her teeth were chattering too hard, and the cold had seeped so deep into her bones that she could barely think. He did not wait for a response. Instead, he carefully lifted her coat to examine the wound in her side, his expression growing darker when he saw the amount of blood she had lost. He pulled off his bandana and pressed it against the injury, making her gasp with pain. "I know it hurts, but I need to slow the bleeding," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "My cabin is about 2 miles from here. Can you stay awake that long? I need you to fight, you hear me? Do not you dare give up now." There was something about his voice, about the fierce determination in his eyes that sparked something inside her. She managed a small nod, and she saw relief flash across his face. He removed his coat and wrapped it around her, adding another layer of warmth to her failing body, then lifted her as carefully as if she were made of glass. He held her against his chest with one arm while he used the other to pull himself back into the saddle, settling her across his lap where he could keep pressure on her wound while guiding the horse. The ride that followed was a blur of pain and cold and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek. He talked to her the entire time, telling her about his ranch, about his horse named Thunder, about anything and everything to keep her conscious and fighting. His voice became her anchor, the one thing keeping her tethered to life as the storm raged around them. She learned that his name was Benjamin Jackson, that he had been out checking his fence lines when the blizzard hit, that he had almost taken a different route home, but something had made him change his mind at the last moment. "Fate, I suppose," he said quietly, his breath warm against her forehead. "Or maybe just dumb luck. Either way, I am glad I found you when I did. You are going to be all right, you hear me? I am not letting you die out here." His cabin finally appeared through the snow, a sturdy log structure with a barn nearby. He dismounted carefully, still holding her close, and kicked the door open with his boot. The interior was blessedly warm, with a fire still burning in the stone fireplace, and he carried her straight to the bed in the corner. He laid her down gently, then immediately set about stoking the fire higher and lighting several oil lamps to give himself better light to work by. "I am going to have to remove your coat and dress to properly treat that wound," he said, his tone professional but respectful. "I promise you have my word as a gentleman that I will not take any liberties. I just want to help you." She managed another nod, too weak to protest even if she had wanted to. He worked quickly and efficiently, removing her blood-soaked outer layers and carefully cutting away the fabric around the knife wound. She saw his jaw clench when he got a clear look at the injury, a deep gash that ran along her ribcage for about 4 inches. He fetched water from a pot on the stove and clean cloths from a trunk, then began the painful process of cleaning the wound. "This was deliberate," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Someone tried to kill you. Who? Your husband?" The question startled her enough that she found her voice weak and raspy but audible. "How did you know?" "No ring on your finger, but I can see the pale line where one used to be," he said, gesturing to her left hand. "Fresh, too, which means it came off recently. And that wound, it was made by someone who knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage without hitting anything immediately fatal. Someone who wanted you to suffer and bleed out slowly. That takes a special kind of evil, the kind that usually comes from someone close." Tears burned in her eyes, hot and bitter. "Marcus, my husband. I found out he was planning to rob the bank, and when I confronted him, he just pulled out his knife and stuck me. Then he dragged me out into the storm and left me there to die. He said nobody would ever find me, that the snow would cover everything by morning." Benjamin's hand stilled for a moment, and when he looked at her, his eyes blazed with fury. "Marcus Jensen. I know him. He gambles at the saloon in town, owes money to half the territory. I always thought there was something off about him, but I never imagined he would do something like this." He returned his attention to her wound, applying a stinging antiseptic that made her cry out despite her best efforts to stay quiet. He murmured apologies as he worked, his touch as gentle as he could manage while still being thorough. Once the wound was cleaned, he stitched it closed with careful precision, his needle moving with the steady confidence of someone who had done this before. "I learned field medicine during the war," he explained, answering her unspoken question. "Served as a field medic for 3 years before I got shot in the leg and they sent me home. Probably saved more lives than I took, which is something I am grateful for. Now hold still. I am almost done." When he finished, he wrapped clean bandages around her torso, then covered her with several thick quilts. He brought her water and made her sip it slowly, warning her that drinking too fast after such trauma would only make her sick. She obeyed, too exhausted to do anything else, and watched as he moved around the cabin preparing food and tending to his horse. He had stripped down to his shirt sleeves, revealing powerful arms and shoulders built from years of hard ranch work, and she found herself studying him with a curiosity that surprised her given her condition. He was handsome in a rugged, weathered way that spoke of a man who spent his life outdoors. He looked to be in his late 20s, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into the sun, and a scar along his jaw that suggested a violent past. But there was also a gentleness to him, a careful consideration in how he moved and spoke that made her feel safe despite the fact that she was alone with a strange man in the middle of nowhere. When he brought her a bowl of warm broth, she managed to prop herself up enough to eat, though her hands shook so badly that he had to help her hold the spoon. The food settled warmly in her stomach, chasing away some of the lingering cold, and she felt her strength beginning to return in tiny increments. "Thank you," she whispered, meeting his eyes. "You saved my life. I do not even know how to begin repaying you for that." "You do not owe me anything," he said firmly. "Any decent person would have done the same. Now rest. That storm is going to last at least another day or two, so you are stuck here with me until it passes. But do not worry, you are safe. I give you my word on that." She believed him. There was something about Benjamin Jackson that inspired trust, a solid reliability that felt like bedrock after years of living with Marcus's lies and manipulations. She let her eyes drift closed, exhaustion pulling her down into sleep despite the pain in her side, and for the first time in hours, she felt like she might actually survive this. The next 2 days passed in a haze of pain, fever, and gradually returning strength. The wound in her side became infected despite Benjamin's careful cleaning, and she spent a full day delirious with fever while he sat beside her bed, cooling her burning skin with damp cloths and forcing water between her lips whenever she was lucid enough to swallow. She had vague memories of him talking to her during those dark hours, his voice a steady presence that kept her from drifting away entirely. When the fever finally broke on the 3rd morning, she woke to find him asleep in a chair beside the bed, his head tilted back at an uncomfortable angle and dark circles under his eyes. She watched him for a long moment, this stranger who had sacrificed his own comfort and safety to care for her, and felt something shift inside her chest. She had spent 3 years with a man who claimed to love her but had ultimately tried to murder her, and here was someone who owed her nothing yet had given her everything. He stirred as if sensing her gaze, his eyes opening slowly. When he saw she was awake and aware, relief washed over his features. "You are back. How do you feel?" "Like I got stabbed and left in a blizzard," she said, attempting a smile. "But better than yesterday, I think. Did I really try to convince you that you were my childhood pet rabbit?" He laughed, a warm sound that filled the cabin. "Among other things. You also sang several hymns, told me the entire plot of some novel you read, and at one point insisted you needed to warn the president about an invasion of purple chickens. Fever does strange things to the mind." Despite everything, she found herself laughing too, though she had to stop quickly when it pulled at her stitches. "I am so sorry you had to deal with that. You could have just left me to sleep it off, and risk you choking or falling out of bed or pulling your stitches. Not a chance." He stood and stretched, his joints popping audibly. "Let me get you some food. Real food this time, not just broth. You need to rebuild your strength." Over breakfast, scrambled eggs and bacon that tasted better than anything she could remember eating, She told him more about her life with Marcus, about how he had courted her with poetry and promises, how he had seemed so different from the rough miners and gamblers who populated Cripple Creek, about how slowly, over 3 years, she had watched that charming facade crumble to reveal the bitter, greedy man underneath, about the gambling debts and the drinking and finally, the discovery of his plan to rob the bank. Benjamin listened without judgment, his expression growing darker with each revelation. Men like that, they are good at hiding what they really are until it is too late. You are not the first person he has fooled, and I am sure you would not have been the last. The question now is what you want to do about it. The storm has passed, and the roads will be clear enough to travel by tomorrow. We could go to the sheriff in Cripple Creek, tell him what happened. She shook her head immediately. The sheriff is Marcus's cousin. That is how he has gotten away with so much for so long. He has family throughout the territory, people who protect him and look the other way when he crosses lines. If I go back there, I will end up dead for real this time. He will make sure of it. Then you need to leave Cripple Creek behind, Benjamin said simply. Start over somewhere new, somewhere he cannot find you. With what money? She asked bitterly. Everything I owned was in that house, and I cannot exactly walk in and pack a bag. I have nothing, Benjamin. No money, no clothes beyond what I was wearing, no family to turn to. My parents died 2 years ago, and I have no siblings. I am completely alone. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if searching for answers in the dark liquid. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. You could stay here, at least for a while until you figure out what you want to do next. I have the space and I could use help around the ranch. The work is hard, but it is honest, and I would pay you fair wages. By spring, you would have enough saved to go wherever you wanted, start whatever life you chose. She stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. You would do that. Let a woman you barely know live on your property. People would talk. They would assume things. Let them talk, he said with a shrug. I stopped caring what people thought about me a long time ago, and for what it is worth, I am not asking anything improper from you. You would have your own space in the barn loft. I fixed it up a few years back, made it into a proper living quarters for when I hired seasonal hands. It has a stove and a real bed and privacy. You would be safe there, and I give you my word I would never cross any lines. This would be purely a business arrangement, employer and employee, nothing more. She wanted to say yes immediately, to grab onto this lifeline he was offering with both hands, but years with Marcus had taught her to be suspicious of generosity, to look for the hidden costs and ulterior motives. Why would you do this for me? What do you really want? He met her gaze steadily, and she saw nothing but sincerity in his eyes. Honestly, I am tired of being alone out here. I have been running this ranch by myself for 5 years now, and it is more work than one person can handle. I have been meaning to hire help, but most of the men in town are either working the mines or are too unreliable to trust. You need a safe place to heal and regroup, and I need an extra pair of hands. It seems like a fair exchange to me. But if you would rather I take you to the train station in Colorado Springs and buy you a ticket anywhere you want to go, I will do that instead. This is your choice, Beatrice. I am just offering options. The way he said her name, with such respect and care, made her chest tighten with emotions she was not ready to examine. She thought about her options, really thought about them without the panic and pain clouding her judgment. She could run, disappear into some distant city where no one knew her name or her past. But she would be starting from nothing, completely alone in a strange place with no skills beyond housekeeping and cooking. Or she could stay here in familiar territory, working for a man who had already proven he was willing to risk his own life to save hers. When she looked at it that way, the choice became obvious. "I will stay," she said quietly, "at least through the winter, and I will work hard, I promise. I know ranching. My father had a small cattle operation before he sold it to try his luck in the mines. I can ride and rope and handle livestock. I am stronger than I look." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a long night. "Then we have a deal. Now finish your breakfast and rest. You have at least another week before you should even think about getting out of that bed, let alone working. Healing takes time, and I am not about to let my new ranch hand die from stubbornness." The weeks that followed were strange and uncomfortable and surprisingly peaceful. Benjamin was true to his word about everything, giving her space and respect while still checking on her healing progress daily. He was also an excellent cook, which surprised her until he explained that he had learned from his mother, who had run a boarding house in Denver before she passed. They fell into an easy routine, eating meals together and talking about everything from politics to literature to the best methods for training horses. She learned that he was 29 years old, that he had bought this ranch with money he had saved during the war and through careful investments, that he had been engaged once, but his fiancée had died of cholera before they could marry. He spoke about it matter-of-factly, without seeking pity, but she heard the old grief in his voice and understood it intimately. They had both loved and lost, both been wounded by life in different ways, and that shared understanding created a bond between them that went deeper than simple friendship. By the time she was well enough to move into the barn loft, spring was beginning to show its first tentative signs. The snow was melting into mud, and green shoots were pushing up through the brown earth, and Beatrice felt like she was emerging from a long winter herself. The loft was everything Benjamin had promised, cozy and private with a window that overlooked the mountains. She spent her first night there lying awake, listening to the horses moving in their stalls below and feeling safer than she had in years. She threw herself into ranch work with an intensity that surprised them both. She mucked stalls and mended fences and helped with the spring calving, working from dawn until dusk, until her muscles ached and her hands were covered in calluses. Benjamin worked alongside her, teaching her the specifics of his operation and praising her quick learning and strong work ethic. They made a good team, anticipating each other's needs and movements with the kind of synchronicity that usually took years to develop. But there was something else growing between them too, something neither of them acknowledged but both felt acutely. It was in the way his hand would linger on hers when he passed her tools, in the way her breath would catch when he smiled at her, in the charged silence that sometimes fell between them during their evening meals. She told herself it was too soon, that she was still technically married even if Marcus had tried to kill her, that she could not possibly be developing feelings for another man so quickly after such trauma. Yet her heart did not seem to care about logic or propriety or anything else. It simply wanted Benjamin Jackson with an intensity that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The situation came to a head on a warm evening in late April. They had spent the day branding calves, exhausting work that left them both covered in dust and sweat and smoke. They had cleaned up and eaten dinner, and now they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. Benjamin had been unusually quiet all day, and she could tell something was weighing on his mind. "I have to go into Cripple Creek tomorrow," he finally said, his tone careful. "I need supplies, and I need to talk to someone about selling some cattle. I will understand if you want to stay here given the circumstances, but I thought you should know." Her stomach clenched with anxiety at the mention of the town, but she also felt a strange curiosity. Have you heard anything? About Marcus, I mean. Does anyone know what happened? I heard some talk the last time I was in town, about 3 weeks ago, Benjamin admitted. Marcus reported you missing, said you went out during the blizzard to check on a neighbor and never came back. There was a search, but of course they did not find anything. Most people assume you froze to death and the animals got to your body. Marcus played the grieving husband for a few days, then went right back to his usual gambling and drinking. If he feels any guilt at all, he is hiding it well. Rage burned through her, hot and bitter. Marcus had tried to murder her and then used her supposed death to gain sympathy and attention. The injustice of it made her want to scream. I want to go with you tomorrow. I want to see him, look him in the eye and let him know he failed. I want everyone to know what he did. Beatrice, Benjamin said gently, turning to face her. I understand the anger, I truly do. But confronting him could be dangerous. He tried to kill you once. What is to stop him from trying again? You, she said simply. I trust you to keep me safe. And I need to do this, Benjamin. I need to face him and take back my life. I have been hiding out here for months, and while I am grateful for everything you have done, I cannot keep running forever. This needs to end. He studied her for a long moment, his blue-gray eyes searching hers. Whatever he saw there must have convinced him, because he finally nodded. All right. We will go together. But you stay close to me at all times, understood? And if things get dangerous, you get out of there immediately. I will not have your death on my conscience. They rode into Cripple Creek the next morning, Benjamin on Thunder and Beatrice on a gentle mare named Willow. The town looked exactly as she remembered. A chaotic sprawl of buildings and muddy streets filled with miners and merchants, and all the rough characters drawn by gold fever. People stared as they passed, their faces registering shock and confusion at seeing a woman who was supposed to be dead riding calmly down the main street. They stopped in front of the saloon where Benjamin said Marcus spent most of his time. Beatrice dismounted, her legs shaking slightly with nerves and adrenaline, and let Benjamin tie the horses to the hitching post. He gave her one last questioning look, making sure she was committed to this course of action, and she nodded firmly. The saloon was dim and smoky inside, filled with the usual morning crowd of men who had nowhere else to be. Conversations died as she walked in, every eye turning to stare at the ghost who had just walked through the door. She scanned the room and found Marcus sitting at a corner table, a bottle of whiskey in front of him and cards in his hand. He looked up casually at the sudden silence, and the color drained from his face when he saw her. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. Surprised to see me, he stood so quickly his chair fell over backward. "Beatrice, but you are supposed to be dead." "You mean you left me to die," she corrected coldly. "There is a difference." "Fortunately for me, someone with an actual conscience found me before your knife wound and the cold finished me off. Now, everyone in this room is going to hear exactly what you did, and then we are going to the sheriff. I do not care if he is your cousin. Attempted murder is still attempted murder." Marcus's shock was rapidly transforming into rage. His hand moved toward his belt, where she knew he kept another knife, and suddenly Benjamin was between them, his own gun drawn and pointed steadily at Marcus's chest. "I would not do that if I were you," Benjamin said quietly, his voice deadly calm. "Every man in this room just heard her accusation, and they are watching to see what you will do next. You reach for that knife, and I will shoot you dead where you stand and call it self-defense. Or you can come quietly and face justice like a man. Your choice." For a moment, Marcus looked like he might try it anyway, but the room full of witnesses and Benjamin's unwavering gun apparently convinced him to choose discretion. He raised his hand slowly, his face twisted with hatred. This is not over. You think you can ruin me and get away with it. You are still my wife, Beatrice, still my property according to the law. Then I will petition for divorce on the grounds of attempted murder, she shot back. I am sure I can find a judge somewhere in Colorado who will see reason. And even if I cannot, I do not care. I would rather live the rest of my life with no legal status at all than spend one more second bound to you. Benjamin had Marcus disarmed and his hands tied before the man could protest further. The sheriff, cousin or not, had no choice but to take Marcus into custody when half the saloon witnessed Benjamin bringing him in, and Beatrice filed formal charges. She gave her full statement. Benjamin corroborated her story and added his testimony about finding her dying in the snow, and a doctor examined her healing wound and confirmed it was consistent with a knife attack. The trial, when it came 6 weeks later, was swift and decisive. Marcus had no defense beyond claiming Beatrice was lying, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The judge, a stern man from Denver who had no family connections to Marcus, sentenced him to 20 years in prison for attempted murder. As the bailiff led Marcus away, he turned and looked at Beatrice one last time, and she saw nothing in his eyes but empty malice. Whatever she had once imagined she loved in this man had never really existed at all. She walked out of that courthouse feeling like she had shed a 1,000-pound weight. Benjamin was waiting on the steps, leaning against a post with his hat tipped back, and the smile he gave her when he saw her expression was brighter than the Colorado sun. She ran to him without thinking, throwing her arms around his neck in a fierce hug that he returned just as enthusiastically. "It is over," she whispered against his shoulder. "It is really, truly over." "You were magnificent in there," he said, pulling back just enough to look at her face. "I have never seen anything like the way you stood up to him. You are the strongest person I have ever met, Beatrice Harper." She had started using her maiden name again after filing for divorce, reclaiming the identity she had lost in her marriage. Hearing Benjamin say it, with such respect and admiration, made her feel like she was finally becoming herself again after years of being diminished. They stood there on the courthouse steps, grinning at each other like fools, and she realized with stunning clarity that she was in love with this man. Completely, irrevocably, terrifyingly in love. The summer that followed was the best of her life. She and Benjamin worked the ranch together, building it into something prosperous and sustainable. They sold cattle for good prices and bought more land and made plans for the future. They also spent their evenings talking and laughing and slowly, carefully, exploring the feelings growing between them. Benjamin was cautious about pushing too fast, conscious of her recent trauma and the fact that her divorce was not yet finalized. But Beatrice had never been more sure of anything in her life. One evening in August, as they sat together watching the stars come out, she finally gathered the courage to say what she had been feeling for months. "Benjamin, I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her, his expression open and attentive. "What is it?" "I love you," she said simply. "I know it is probably too soon, and I know my divorce is not final yet, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I needed you to know. You saved my life, yes, but you also gave me back my life. You made me remember what it feels like to be respected and valued and safe. I love you, and I think I have loved you since the moment you found me in that blizzard and refused to let me die." His eyes widened, and for a horrible moment she thought she had made a terrible mistake. Then he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her eyes fill with tears. When he pulled back, he was smiling wider than she had ever seen. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I have been in love with you for months, but I did not want to push or make you feel obligated because of everything I had done for you. You do not owe me anything, Beatrice. But if you are offering me your heart freely, then I will treasure it for the rest of my life. I promise you that." They sat there holding each other as the stars wheeled overhead, making quiet promises about the future they would build together. When her divorce was finalized that October, Benjamin proposed properly, going down on one knee in the barn with a simple gold ring he had commissioned from a jeweler in Colorado Springs. She said yes, before he even finished asking the question. They married in November of 1889, exactly 1 year after the blizzard that had brought them together. It was a small ceremony in the church in Colorado Springs, far enough from Cripple Creek to avoid uncomfortable questions, but close enough that a few of their friends could attend. Beatrice wore a simple cream-colored dress and carried wildflowers that Benjamin had somehow found, despite the season. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Benjamin kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was what love was supposed to feel like. They spent their first winter as a married couple working to expand the ranch and making plans for spring. Benjamin talked about breeding horses in addition to cattle, and Beatrice suggested starting a small vegetable garden to sell produce in town. They dreamed together, planned together, built something real and lasting together. The shadows of their pasts did not disappear entirely, both still carrying scars from what they had endured, but they faced them together, and that made all the difference. In the spring of 1890, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. She told Benjamin over breakfast, watching nervously for his reaction. He set down his coffee cup very carefully, stared at her for a long moment, and then let out a whoop of joy so loud it spooked the horses in the barn. He swept her up in his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing until they cried, and she knew their child would be born into a home filled with love and security. Their son arrived in December, a healthy baby with Benjamin's blue-gray eyes and Beatrice's dark hair. They named him Thomas William Jackson, after both of their fathers, and he became the center of their universe. Benjamin was a devoted father, tender and patient in ways that reminded Beatrice daily of how lucky she was. She watched him rock their son to sleep and sing off key lullabies and change diapers without complaint, and her love for him grew even deeper. The ranch prospered over the next few years. Benjamin's horse breeding operation took off, with buyers coming from across Colorado to purchase his well-trained animals. Beatrice's garden expanded into a significant operation, supplying several restaurants in Colorado Springs with fresh produce. They hired 2 ranch hands to help with the increased workload, good men who treated Beatrice with respect and worked hard for fair wages. In 1892, they had a daughter, Clara Mee, who had her father's stubborn determination and her mother's quick wit. 2 years later came another son, James Benjamin, who was quiet and thoughtful and obsessed with the ranch dogs. Their home filled with noise and love, and the beautiful chaos of children growing up in wide, open spaces. Beatrice sometimes thought about the woman she had been before that terrible night in the blizzard, young and naive, and desperate for a love she did not understand. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a distant past that barely seemed real. She had been broken down and remade, forged in ice and blood into someone stronger and wiser and more whole than she had ever been before. One evening in the summer of 1895, she and Benjamin sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was teaching Clara how to rope fence posts, while James toddled after them with a stick horse. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything in golden light, and Beatrice felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "What are you thinking about?" Benjamin asked, reaching over to take her hand. "About how that blizzard was the worst and best thing that ever happened to me," she said honestly. "About how I was dying in the snow, certain my life was over, and instead it was just beginning. About how grateful I am that you were stubborn enough to ride out in that storm, that you found me when you did, that you gave me a chance to start over." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "I was just thinking the same thing. That storm brought me the greatest gift of my life. It brought me you and this family, and a future I never dared imagine I could have. Every single day, I thank God I took that route home." They sat together in comfortable silence, hands entwined, watching their children and their ranch and their life together. The scars from their pasts had faded but not disappeared, woven into the fabric of who they had become. Beatrice still had the thin line along her ribcage from Marcus's knife, and Benjamin still limped slightly when the weather turned cold, but these marks were simply part of their story. They had both been wounded by life, both left bleeding in their own ways, but they had found each other and built something beautiful from the ruins. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Thomas called out that he had successfully roped a post, and Clara was demanding her turn. Benjamin stood and offered Beatrice his hand, pulling her to her feet with that same gentle strength he had shown from the very beginning. They walked together toward their children, toward the life they had created together, toward a future that stretched out bright and boundless before them. Beatrice had been left to die in a blizzard by a man who had promised to love her. But she had been found by a cowboy who actually understood what love meant, who showed her through actions rather than empty words that she was valued and treasured and safe. The cold had nearly finished what her husband started that night, but Benjamin Jackson had refused to let her go. He had fought for her when she could not fight for herself, and in doing so, he had given her everything. Years later, when their children asked how they had met, Beatrice and Benjamin would exchange knowing glances and smile. They told a simplified version of the story, about a blizzard and a rescue and love blooming in unexpected places. They left out the worst details, the violence and betrayal and near death, because their children did not need to carry those burdens. What mattered was the essential truth at the heart of the tale, that even in the darkest moments, even when death seems certain, life can surprise you. Love can surprise you. Healing is possible, and second chances are real, and sometimes the worst day of your life is actually the doorway to something better than you ever imagined. The ranch continued to grow and prosper through the late 1890s. By the turn of the century, Benjamin and Beatrice had established themselves as one of the most successful ranching operations in the region. Their reputation for quality horses and honest dealing brought customers from as far as Wyoming and New Mexico. The children grew strong and capable, learning the ranching life from parents who worked alongside them rather than simply giving orders. Thomas, their eldest, showed a natural talent for training horses that exceeded even his father's considerable skill. By the time he was 15, he was handling horses that other trainers had given up on as too wild or too stubborn. He had inherited his mother's patience and his father's steady confidence, and the combination made him exceptional at his craft. Clara proved to have a head for business that surprised everyone. She started keeping the ranch books when she was 12, and by 14, she had reorganized their entire accounting system and identified several ways they could increase profits without increasing workload. She accompanied her mother to town for business meetings and negotiations, learning to hold her own in rooms full of men who initially underestimated her because of her age and gender. James remained the quiet one, but his deep connection with animals made him invaluable around the ranch. He seemed to understand instinctively when a cow was about to calve, or when a horse was developing a limp, before it became visible. He spent hours sitting in the pastures just watching the animals, learning their patterns and personalities. In 1898, word reached them that Marcus had died in prison, killed in a fight with another inmate. Beatrice felt nothing when she heard the news, no satisfaction or grief or even relief. That chapter of her life had closed so completely that Marcus's death changed nothing about her present reality. She mentioned it to Benjamin that evening, matter-of-factly, and he simply nodded and squeezed her hand. They never spoke of Marcus again. The new century brought changes to Colorado and to their corner of it. The gold boom in Cripple Creek was starting to fade, and some of the wild, lawless energy of the region was settling into something more civilized. Telephones appeared in some of the larger towns, and there was even talk of electricity coming to the area, though Benjamin joked that they were too far out to see such modern conveniences in their lifetime. In 1903, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant again at age 36, a surprise that both delighted and terrified her. She had assumed her childbearing years were behind her, but apparently fate had other plans. Benjamin was over the moon with joy, though he hovered over her with such anxious protectiveness that she had to remind him she had done this 3 times before and knew what she was doing. Their 4th child, a daughter they named Helen Rose, arrived healthy and strong that winter. She had red gold hair that came from some distant ancestor and green eyes that matched neither parent, and she was adored by her entire family from the moment she drew breath. Her older siblings doted on her shamelessly, and Benjamin spent hours rocking her and telling her stories about the ranch and the family she had been born into. As the years continued to pass, Beatrice found herself reflecting more on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about the girl she had been, so desperate for love and belonging that she had convinced herself Marcus was her answer. She thought about the terrifying helplessness of lying in the snow, certain she would die there alone. She thought about Benjamin appearing through the storm like an answer to a prayer she had not even known how to form. Most of all, she thought about resilience and second chances, and the way life can reshape itself into something new. She had lost everything that night in the blizzard, her marriage and her home and nearly her life itself. But from that loss had come everything she truly valued now. A partner who respected and cherished her, children she loved fiercely, work that gave her purpose, and a sense of self-worth that no one could take from her. On their 15th wedding anniversary in 1904, Benjamin gave her a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "Write our story," he said simply, "so our children and grandchildren will know where they came from. So they will understand that even terrible things can lead to beautiful outcomes." She started that very night, sitting at the kitchen table with an oil lamp and her new journal, trying to find words adequate to capture everything she had experienced. She wrote about Marcus and the betrayal, about the blizzard and the knife wound, about Benjamin finding her and choosing to save her even though it would have been easier to ride past. She wrote about falling in love slowly and carefully, about learning to trust again, about building a life and a family from the ashes of her old existence. The writing became a nightly ritual, her way of processing and preserving their history. She filled that first journal within a year and started a second, then a third. She wrote about the daily rhythms of ranch life, about watching their children grow and develop into remarkable people, about the deep partnership she and Benjamin had cultivated over the years. She wrote honestly about the hard times too, the droughts and the difficult calving seasons and the times when money was tight, because she wanted her descendants to understand that a good life was not the same as an easy life. In 1906, Thomas married a schoolteacher from Colorado Springs named Sarah, a practical and kind young woman who fit seamlessly into the family. They built a house on the southern corner of the ranch property, close enough to help with the operation but far enough for privacy. A year later, they made Beatrice and Benjamin grandparents for the first time with the birth of a son. They named Benjamin Thomas Jackson, ensuring the family names would continue another generation. Clara, at 22, shocked everyone by announcing she had been accepted to a business college in Denver. She wanted to get a formal education in accounting and business management, she explained, so she could come back and help expand the ranch operations even further. Beatrice was so proud she cried, amazed and grateful that her daughter had opportunities she herself had never even imagined at that age. James, at 20, seemed content to remain on the ranch indefinitely. He had no interest in marriage or leaving, perfectly happy spending his days with the animals and the land. Benjamin sometimes worried that James was too isolated, but Beatrice understood her son's need for quiet and space. He was happy in his own way, and that was what mattered. Little Helen, at age 7, was already showing signs of being the most adventurous of all their children. She could ride before she could read properly, and she was constantly begging her father to teach her to rope and brand and do all the same work her brothers had learned. Benjamin could deny her nothing, so Helen grew up learning ranching alongside the adults, tiny and determined and utterly fearless. The ranch itself had become something of a local landmark by the late 1900s. People traveled from across the state to buy Jackson horses, or to tour their operation and learn their methods. Benjamin and Beatrice gave presentations at agricultural fairs about sustainable ranching practices and ethical animal treatment. They had become leaders in their community, respected for both their business success and their personal integrity. In 1908, on a crisp autumn evening much like hundreds of others they had shared, Beatrice and Benjamin celebrated 20 years together since that fateful blizzard. They walked to the spot where he had found her, a place they visited every year on the anniversary of their meeting. The landscape had changed some over the decades, but they could still identify the general area where her life had nearly ended, and their story had truly begun. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had taken the other route that day?" Benjamin asked, voicing the question that sometimes haunted both of them. "If I had been 5 minutes later, or if the snow had been too thick to see you?" "I try not to," Beatrice admitted, leaning against his solid warmth. "Because wondering about it changes nothing, and it only makes me anxious about how close we came to missing each other entirely. I prefer to focus on the fact that you did find me, that you did save me, that we did build this life together. The what-ifs do not matter compared to what actually is." He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together in the fading light, looking out across the ranch they had built together. From the house in the distance came the sounds of their children and grandchildren gathering for the anniversary dinner Sarah had organized. Smoke rose from the chimney, welcoming and warm, and lights glowed in the windows against the approaching darkness. "I love you, Beatrice Jackson," Benjamin said quietly. "I loved you the moment I saw you lying in that snow, even though I did not know it yet. I loved you as I stitched up your wound and prayed you would survive the fever. I loved you as I watched you heal and grow strong and reclaim your life. I have loved you every single day since, and I will love you every day that remains to us." She turned in his arms and kissed him, tasting 20 years of partnership and passion and deep, abiding friendship. I love you too. You gave me my life back, and then you gave me a life beyond anything I could have dreamed. You are my best friend, my partner, the father of my children, and the love of my life. Thank you for not riding past that day. Thank you for stopping, for seeing me, for refusing to let me go. They walked back to the house together, hand in hand as always, ready to celebrate with the family they had created together. Inside, warmth and laughter and love awaited them, the tangible proof of everything they had survived and built and become. The years continued to unfold with their mix of joy and challenge, loss and gain, the everyday miracles that make up a life well lived. They weathered economic downturns and harsh winters, celebrated weddings and births, mourned the passing of friends and the inevitable changes that time brought. Through it all, Beatrice and Benjamin remained each other's constant, the steady center around which everything else revolved. In their later years, when their hair had gone gray and their bodies moved more slowly, they would still walk out to that spot in the pasture where he had found her all those years ago. They would stand together, remembering the blizzard and the blood and the desperate fight for survival that had brought them together. And they would give thanks for the incredible gift of their shared life, built from the worst moment either of them had ever experienced. Their story became family legend, passed down through generations as an example of resilience and second chances, and the transformative power of real love. Their descendants would farm that same land and breed those same bloodlines of horses, and tell the story of the woman who was left to die in a blizzard, and the cowboy who refused to let that happen. Beatrice lived to see her grandchildren grown and her great-grandchildren born, surrounded always by the family, and the life she and Benjamin had built together. When she finally passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, it was with Benjamin's hand in hers and the certain knowledge that she had lived fully and loved completely. Benjamin followed her less than a year later, unable and unwilling to exist in a world without his Beatrice. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and the dates that mattered. The day they met, the day they married, the days they departed. But their love story lived on in the land they had nurtured, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their names and their values forward into the future. It lived on in the journals Beatrice had written, carefully preserved and treasured by their descendants as precious family history. And it lived on in the simple truth that even in the darkest, coldest moments, when death seems certain and hope feels impossible, love can appear unexpectedly and change everything. The blizzard that should have killed Beatrice Harper had instead delivered her to Benjamin Jackson. And together, they had created something beautiful and lasting that would echo through generations. Their story was proof that endings can be beginnings, that the worst day of your life might actually be the door to your best life, and that sometimes being saved is not really about rescue at all, but about finding the person who helps you remember how to save yourself.